Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's hard to follow lunch, but I guess it's better than being before lunch, where people are angry at you, scowling at you, trying to get to their meal. I'm so honored to be here. Bernie, congratulations, and thank you on a visionary tenure at CRL and for leading the organization so brilliantly. I know that you'll be missed by many. And for allowing me to join the board under your tenure and to be a partner for a few months of overlap in your work. And welcome to Greg, who I met earlier, who's here as well, and I look forward to working with you as well. So, I'm particularly proud. So there's on the CRL board, which is an organization that's relatively new to me. There are all of you very wonderful and amazing librarians or folks that come out of the library world, and then there's a few kind of oddballs like myself who are working in solidarity with you but don't have that particularly amazing expertise that you bring to the work that you do. But what I do have is a wonderful kind of sense of solidarity with CRL as an organization, as the leader of a research nonprofit that if we're doing our work well, similar to CRL, kind of hums in the background and no one knows about it. I mean, it's like, the Social Science Research Council is meant to hum in the background as a kind of infrastructure to support scholarship and research. And for me, that's a good day if we're able to do that. And so I feel, as I said, a very strong sense of solidarity. I'm deeply gratified by the response that we've received to the Secure Knowledge Task Force report, which I'm going to talk about this afternoon, including a little bit about the origins of it. But more importantly, I'm completely and deeply honored, myself and my staff that worked so hard on this report with the task force, that it would be a touchstone for your conversations here over the next day and a half. So thank you very much. And I also am allergic to Chicago, so I learned yesterday taking my lovely river walk. So forgive me for being a little froggy. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit how it came to be. I mean, I think there are some immediate sort of urgencies or stories around the origin of the Secure Knowledge Task Force, but it's really about enduring issues about the optimal conditions for the social sciences, for social research more generally at any given moment. And so although we began to galvanize about 2.5 years ago, where there was a growing public discourse about being in a post-fact society, being in a post-news society, the way in which information was being politicized variously and polarized, we really understood and brought people to the table who could have a conversation about long-term commitments. So, many of us in this room are old enough to have seen many sort of political ebbs and flows, but the enduring issues about the integrity of knowledge and about academic integrity sort of remain. So this was our committee. Some of these folks are known to you. Bernadette Gray-Little, the Chancellor Emeritus of the University of Kansas, was co-chair with my predecessor at the Social Science Research Council, the historian and political scientist Ira Katz-Nelson. Because we wanted to talk about the various sectors that are stakeholders in social knowledge, we wanted to have someone like Rush Holt, who brought to the table not only his experience as the president of the American Academy of Arts and, for the Advancement of Science, but also his time as a legislator working with the federal government in support of research. Harvard researcher Gary King, director of the Institute for Quantitative Social Science there. Cora Merritt, a sociologist probably known to some of you. She was a former deputy director of the NSF SBE Directorate. Ken Pruitt, my predecessor as well at the SSRC, and former director of the U.S. Census Bureau. John Reed, a former CEO of Citibank, who brought a kind of private sector expertise, and Amy Ziegart, who's an expert at cybersecurity and other issues. So this was our sort of wonderfully, I think, to begin motley crew that became a really, I think, a group that really congealed and worked well together. So in the course of putting this together, we cared a lot about progress and about process and about trying to engage as many stakeholder communities as possible in crafting this document. So it is the document of the task force, but it is very much a document that we, at very early stages, at stages when it's hard to share things with colleagues, were sharing and passing around. So including as early as 2017, in the fall, we were sort of circulating this with an organization of affiliates that we call the College and University Fund. So we shared some very early drafts of this with higher education leaders, with deans, provosts, deans of social science, and the like. The SSRC, some of you might know, is started in 1923. We're actually incorporated in the state of Illinois. We initially start with the presidents and executive directors of 7 disciplinary associations, from the American Anthropological Association to the American Political Science Association, and we still convene those executive directors several times a year. So that was another stakeholder community that really weighed in on what was happening here. We've twice presented the drafts of this to the American Association of Political Science and Social Sciences Leadership Group that meets every spring. And then after we had a penultimate draft, we circulated it to colleagues variously all over the country. So, as Bernie's kind introduction suggested, the report and the task force saw itself kind of trying to engage two particular questions, 2 core questions. One being, given that many sectors support, do, share, and use social knowledge, social research is being carried out, and the fact that social research is being carried out by university-based researchers, but also by the government, the private sector, philanthropy, nonprofit organizations, and indeed, if you think about something like data journalism in the media, what is the current alignment of these organizations in a kind of new, emergent, and dynamic kind of social research ecology? How do we want to sort of diagnose and identify and understand that? And what is the ideal alignment of these? What is the ideal alignment of this new social ecology for the academy and also for social research more broadly? Additionally, the task force was interested in thinking about the relationship between new technologies and new institutional ecologies, as well as all of this sort of changing dynamic of the social research ecology happening in the context of really heightened public skepticism about what we do as researchers, what researchers do, and also about sort of knowledge and facts more broadly. And the questions here were, what is to be done by social science organizations and researchers in this dramatically new environment? How do we make the case, or as Greg said in a meeting that we had, what is the value proposition for the work that we do? So here's the headline, and I'll tell you how we got here and offer a few recommendations to share with you for discussion about the task force. There's an urgent need to create a new institutional infrastructure supporting social science research and the cross-sectoral collaboration to meet this challenge. The task force calls for the forging of a new research compact to identify a set of shared understandings and expectations that build trust in and support for the scientific enterprise of today and tomorrow. So importantly, this was not a kind of sky is falling exercise. The task force, it was really important for them to both identify threats and opportunities to the work that we do and the work that we support. So they wanted to identify both and sort of as this sort of context, as the backdrop to the work. So the first, of course, is flat federal funding, both with regards to federal support for humanities and social research more generally from year to year, but also as a sort of proportion of federal investments and research more generally. Declining federal support in both symbolic and political ways. Those of you who are domain experts or follow what's been happening with political science, you know that there's been a lot of controversy about what political science is for. Is it supposed to almost be a kind of state apparatus in which it's supposed to do the work of the federal government? Is it an analytic body for the federal government? Or is it a basic research field in the social sciences? And so a lot of these debates have come to the fore about political science as a focus in some ways, but about the work that we all do more generally. What good is it? What good is it for the state? What good is it for the nation state? So that's part of this new context. As I said, there's also this rising public skepticism and mistrust in institutions more generally, but also in a public doubt about the power of evidence to help arbitrate disagreements. So, we've gone from a place where having better facts and better data are going to win the day. You can't always guarantee that that's going to be the case, and we're moving to a place where one has to have the best facts and the best data, but also the best narrative. And if you can have a lobbying group behind you, that might help as well. And so partly I am a sociologist of science and a sociologist of knowledge, and it's very much this kind of battle, I think, or this moment that really forces us to think about what are all the things that make something a true fact, right? And sadly, in this moment, it's increasingly the case that having the best data is only part of that, right? There's all of these other institutional things that come to bear as well as widespread skepticism about data, about the sources of data, about the integrity of data, and the like. The task force noted as well, as part of this backdrop, the politicization and misuse of social knowledge. So a lot of our conversation, particularly given that Ken Pruitt was part of the committee, was about the debates that are happening about the 2020 census. Of course, in the context of us doing this, the task force convening to come up with the report, we get the Cambridge Analytica scandal that places further scrutiny and public mistrust on the work that we do, to the extent that it's about information and data. At the same time, and this is an opportunity, I think, not necessarily a threat, there are, I think, apt demands for accountability on the part of the research community, pressure to provide evidence of relevance and impact of our work. I think we're feeling that at all of our organizations. There are demands for more speedy publication and for short-term results, which is in tension, of course, with the aim of basic research, the aim of the usefulness of useless knowledge, to use Abraham Flexner's phrasing. And also there are, in good ways and bad ways, particularly in the computational social sciences and the data science, unprecedented demands for the generation of novel results, which means it's less, you're less likely to get published in Science or PNAS or some of the sort of high impact, high prestige generalist journals if you're not sort of almost having a kind of Freakonomics effect with your results, right? So there's less interest in publishing null findings. There's less interest in publishing, things that we've done as scholars for centuries, making incremental advances in knowledge, right? There's where one gets the sort of shine and prestige is sort of saying, for millennia we thought it was this, and my one data set, N of 250, tells you, no, now it's this, and now we know. It gets you on the cover of PNAS, but it also destabilizes how particularly the public thinks about how knowledge works and how the accumulation of facts into knowledge happens over time. So opportunities. There's an opportunity to forge a new research compact, to have, I think, a gimlet-eyed look at where we are right now and what's going on, and to sort of think about what, if we were going to take the lead as scholars, what is the sort of ideal composition we would want for the research compact and the research community that we need to best do our work. There's an opportunity here to reimagine collaboration among researchers, institutions, policymakers, and the private sector. And recall, of course, that the constellation of the research compact we're currently working in, right, is an artifact of the mid-20th century. Is an artifact of kind of post-war investments in research universities and the like. And so, as much as we might lament some of the changes that are happening, it's not the worst thing in the world that we're facing a kind of paradigm shift in how the state and universities and the like work together. Certainly after we've lived through generations of research in which IP and all sorts of other interventions are happening in universities, and we really need to reckon with the role of the private sector in the work that we do. And of course, there's an opportunity to improve the pursuit of knowledge and its potential to contribute to the common good. So, as I mentioned, part of the work of the task force was diagnostic, was to really, as I said, take a really gimlet-eyed view of kind of where we sit and what's happening, and how various institutions are playing, in some instances, the very same role that they've played in the kind of social knowledge or the knowledge ecology, but in other ways are playing new roles, or roles have been amplified that might have been less significant in years prior. So there's a longer conversation of this in the Secure Knowledge Task Force report, but I just want to lay out just a few ideas for conversation. So the government, the US government, whereas government once focused primarily on data collection, gathering vast amounts of survey and administrative data, today, government might also be involved in social experiments, including nudge units that sponsor or conduct behavioral research and improve governance, arguably, right? And so, moreover, it's the case that there are other institutions that collect more research than the federal government. So it's not, that's not only always, it's no longer the sort of first and best place to go for data. And here, the suggestion here about the nudge units is now we're also, as researchers, in some ways, either collaborating with, if you're working in the federal government as a social scientist with one of these nudge units, or competing with the federal government with regards to social and behavioral research. NGOs and nonprofits. The network of nonprofits that relied on and generated social knowledge was once small. Today, advocacy associations and think tanks engage with social science on issues ranging from human rights and public health to education reform and racial inequality. So this is, again, potentially an opportunity for collaboration, but it's also potentially a threat. I mean, scholars create scholarship, and there is, and I think we have to, as much as we can, draw the distinction between a white paper from a think tank and really deeply researched work that comes out of archives, that comes out of deep research and analysis and the like. In my own field, in my work at the SSRC, we find that sometimes other nonprofit organizations that are sometimes partners will come to us and initially want to have a conversation about getting academic researchers engaged in something they care about, public health, human rights issues, and the like. But then we'll make a decision, sometimes a decision that's a fiscal decision, to hire a consultant and give that person a month to give them a white paper on human rights issues, right? And so that's not using archives, that's also often syncretic. And that work does important work in the world, because often what we're not good at as a scholarly community is sort of making claims about impact and policy, and this work often does that better than we do. But it's also the case that it doesn't come out of a kind of deep well of scholarly work or tradition often. The media. Large media firms now employ data journalists who gather data, conduct research and analysis, and generate accessible accounts of social life. Obviously, the sort of standard bearer of this is an organization like ProPublica, a nonprofit journalism organization that does marvelous work. But it's also the case that there is, this is existing together alongside data scientists who work in the academy. Philanthropies, historically vital sources of support for social science research. Philanthropies increasingly conduct research in-house or commission research that focuses more on short-term payoffs than long-term knowledge innovation and capacity building. Corporations. Most dramatically, private industry has destabilized, we argue in the report, the social knowledge system. Corporations, of course, have always invested in social science research. You might think of, Bell Labs, for example. But today, the core product of many of the most successful businesses is social information. Today's companies own exabytes of social data and may also control the tools to gather and analyze that data. As a consequence, private sector norms around flexibility, efficiency, and profitability are now taking their place alongside scholarly ones of reliability, critical scrutiny, and openness. And we can have a conversation. I'll say a little bit about a project that we're doing with Facebook. But part of what that project has been a challenge there are their very different organizational research cultures and ideas about what one is giving up to be efficient with regards to the robustness and rigor of the findings, for example. And then libraries. So I'll just offer a few reflections here. I know that you have many more. So libraries as a milestone on the pathway of the data turn of recent years are key to social science research. Across the humanities, sciences, and social sciences, our subject libraries are now also data libraries. They are vital sources of novel forms of social data, as maps, as texts, as images become databases. And I would love to hear if Bernie thinks this is true as well of CRL. I mean, one question for the future of CRL is sort of, do we datafy all of this stuff and make it available in a different sort of way? And both information scientists and library scientists are increasingly also data scientists who both shape and engage in social research in the private sector and also at colleges and universities. So lots of transformation happening in lots of different sectors and across and between sectors as well. So the task force offered that collaboration across these sectors is not absent today, but tends to be ad hoc. That offered that the collaborations that we have or that we need to build need to forge ongoing connections, but be more purposely designed, need to be scaled up, and need to be more inclusive. So I'm going to offer now recommendations that a few of several recommendations that the task force offered and 5 different areas: funding, data, ethics and data integrity, research quality, and training. So with regards to funding, the task force noted that sources and types of support for social research are changing. As we said, government funding is flat and under challenge for political reasons. Foundation support for research has shifted, often to short time frames. Private companies are investing heavily in social research, but for profit maximizing purposes or in ways that really atomize the research experience. So certainly at Facebook or other organizations, or even small organizations that deal with sort of data as their bottom line, the sort of testing, A/B testing, market testing that they'll do in the organization is not for a kind of greater good necessarily, and it's for really products and sort of maximizing sort of products and profit that is in ways that it can be at odds with the scholarly enterprise. So one key recommendation from the task force report about funding is to bring together representatives of government firms, foundations, the academy, libraries, other stakeholders to the table to design new funding partnerships with an eye to creating and sustaining an integrated infrastructure for social research. And really to make the case that we still, although various roles may have shifted over time, that we really are still all in it together, and that the ecology is really necessary for vigorous and rigorous social research. With regards to research ethics, the task force noted a few things: that there was a need for a greater protection of human subjects in social science research. For example, in the Facebook project that my colleague Jason Rohde will talk about in the next session, one of the issues we faced was having to deal with projects that we required to go through IRB to apply to be part of this grant project that were expedited or exempt from IRB. So the IRB doesn't understand sort of data sets to be human subjects. However, we know that the potential of networked harms to communities for when you bring together, aggregate data or federate data sets can be quite pronounced. And so how do we think about in this moment a new way of thinking about research ethics? Current research ethics systems are centered around institutional review boards and individual informed consent, which we have here maybe, but to my mind are clearly inadequate. And there's a pretty pronounced regulatory lag with regards to trying to get IRB up to speed with what's happening quickly in information science and data science. The task force also suggested that we consider not just individual harms, but also potential broader social harms of data research. So if we think about something like Cambridge Analytica and the hit we took with public trust, with the hit we took with legitimacy, I mean, the lead figure, Alexander Kogan, and the Cambridge Analytica scandal was a social scientist. He was a psychologist at Cambridge for a time. And so that was a hit to the legitimacy and reputation of scholars as well, and as well as the issue of collective or network harms, which I mentioned. So some recommendations here. Develop a 21st century research ethics that takes into account technological change, social and political change, and their potential impacts and do this in a way that is based in empirical research. And so this is not, the task force didn't suggest that we should change IRB, but that might be one way of thinking about it, but that it really is incumbent upon us as institutional actors, as researchers, as scholars to, in this moment of regulatory lag, to be thinking about what are our responsibilities as scholars and as researchers with regards to research ethics. We are clearly not in a space where there's going to be government intervention into making ethics more rigorous, and so a lot of that falls back to us, even as many of us have spent our whole research careers complaining about how bad IRB is for how it gets in the way of us doing our work. But this is really a new day, and I think that there are risks that we can anticipate, particularly in the realm of data science, but ones we can't even anticipate when you think about how data travels from its original provenance and is used elsewhere, or when data sets are federated. So we need to think about that. The task force also suggested developing new codes of conduct. Are there new kinds of norms that we can generate in our communities with regards to ethics, data privacy, and data security? As Bernie mentioned, I mean, one of my fields is in the sociology of science, and I've spent probably the last 15 years thinking about the sociology of genetics more generally. And one of the things that have been interesting in that field is that through the work of LaTanya Sweeney at Harvard and other people, we now know that it's pretty much possible to identify any data. And so particularly in the health sciences, a new kind of ethos has been created in which people are really being asked through the pressure of the research community to not re-identify. So one can always re-identify if one tries hard enough, but with regards to health science researchers, there's a kind of growing sense that people need to ethically commit to not re-identifying even when one can. Research quality, the task force suggested a couple of things, that there's pressure on the peer review systems as the vehicle for evaluating and ensuring the quality of research. So, every time we have, and, particularly in psychology, some scandal around, peer review or replication, these sorts of things, it's chipping away at that public trust and skepticism piece. But it also is, saying to us, why is if it takes so long and we're not getting it right, should we kind of think about or have an honest conversation about the peer review process? The current environment in which research scandals, fraudulent journals, and the poor outcomes of replication studies have raised is one in which the questions have been raised about the integrity and value of social research. So the recommendation here is to convene publishers, scholarly societies, and others to reimagine and improve the peer review process, particularly around time to publication. I mean, I think that we can agree it should not take 2 years to publish a paper, and we should be willing to have a conversation as a scholarly community about what are the sort of combinations of incentives and systemic change that we can make to make this no longer the case. Research training, the task force spent a lot of time thinking about an alignment, a kind of human resources alignment with regard to how we are training graduate students in this moment, and the disconnect between the kinds of careers that social scientists are being trained for, but I mean, this is true of humanists, this is really true across the academy, and the full range of professional settings that offer rewarding jobs. The task force suggested that we need to find new ways to support generations of social researchers to work in a range of professions and ideally move across professions and sectors in the context of their lives. And so I think, particularly for the students that I'm training now at Columbia, they hope that they will start out at a tenure track job, but they also imagine that they might have other types of jobs besides. And this is really consistent with a way of working in which people no longer imagine that they're going to be at the same institution for 40 years or 30 years or even 10 years. And so how do we sort of do the training of library science scholars, social scientists and the like, with regards to thinking about what this new true reality is with regards to research training. So a few recommendations. One was building on the current efforts in our institutions, convene academic and private sector leaders to design ways of incorporating digital and other technical skills into collaborative and translational skills in doctoral training. So there are a few efforts you know about already. There's the Mellon Public Voices Fellowship, for example. There are other endeavors to do this kind of broadening of the work and to also engage private sector leaders. One of the things, some of the data that we got as the background for the task force was about, and you've probably seen some of this in the press, the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of social researchers that are hired every year by McKinsey, by the private sector, and in some instances more than colleges and universities. So we are kind of on the precipice of a point in which there will be more PhD researchers working outside of the academy, right, and kind of full-time FTE employment than there are working in the academy. And so that, offers some challenges, but also some opportunities for how we think about who our colleagues are and the world of scholarly knowledge production. Secondly, there was a recommendation to work with disciplinary associations to build paths of professional engagement for social researchers working outside of the academy. As I said, we're an organization born out of disciplinary associations, and we have close ties there. And we've been working very closely with a few to sort of try to do work like this. We've been talking to your former board colleague, Jem Grossman, about what kinds of convenings we might do with the AHA to sort of make this more present and the work that they do. Jim will tell you on any given day that there are, many historians working, outside of the academy, and they've known this for a very long time, but it's sometimes hard to get them into disciplinary associations and disciplinary communities, which means you also don't have people operating with the same professional norms, and we can talk about that maybe in the conversation. Wonderfully, the American Sociological Association, my disciplinary home, has started an endeavor to where they do a kind of pre-conference. They're going to do a pre-conference this year that invites people who are sociologists working outside of the academy to come to the American Sociological Association meetings and be engaged in the community once again. There's a lot of benefits potentially for publishing and for the disciplinary associations. I mean, our colleagues who don't work in the academy, can pay full freight as members of organizations. It's not like trying to create caucuses and space, rightly so, for colleagues who are working in more precarious situations. And so these are relationships that can actually help support the future of organizations if we think about ways to incorporate them. So data, I know this is a conversation you had with presentations last year. I know that Meg will talk about this, and my colleague Jason Rohde, should he get here from O'Hare in time. So I'll just offer a few glosses here from the task force, and I know this will come up through the course of conversation today. So data, the task force wanted to talk about the sort of tension between wanting to maximize the potential of big data research and minimize its risks. Wanted to underscore the potential for better understanding that might be derived from data sharing across sectors, building on past collaborations between scholars and the government around large data sets like the census and new collaborations. So the issue here, though, or the concept here was sort of how can we think in new ways through interventions in data science or new techniques in data science about how the census is useful, right? It might be kind of one way to think about new collaborations instead of between government and academy. And the task force noted different incentives for data sharing across sectors, and in some cases drastically different research cultures, as I mentioned, including around the privacy of personal data. So the key recommendation here was to build on a range of current experiments and innovative proposals to promote the development of a data commons, multi-source platforms that might bring public and private data together in conditions that are protective of privacy, but allow access by independent researchers working on major public issues. And so soon after we did this work, or as we were in the midst of doing this work, we were introduced to an opportunity to play a role in a new research paradigm, a new research collaboration that we call the SSRC, the Social Data Initiative, that Jason will talk about fulsomely, but I'm just going to say a few words about for a few minutes and then be happy to have some conversation with you. So this is a project that we started with an organization, an entity called Social Science One, that was started by Gary King, who was on the task force, a member of our task force that we launched in 2017. Started by Gary King in 2018 with Nate Pursley, who's a legal scholar at Stanford University. And the aim is really to provide sources of funding and support for research on social data more generally. This particular project is not funded by Facebook, so no funding at all comes from Facebook. It's funded by 8 nonprofit organizations, including one from the UK, the Children's Investment Foundation Fund, which provided funding exclusively for scholars from the Global South or people not working on Western Europe or the US. So it's truly an international project. It's directed by my colleague Jason Rohde, who I was going to point to and applaud because it's been a heck of a project to get off of the ground. But he's not here, and so we can applaud him when he walks in the room and finally arrives from O'Hare. We've had, taking the recommendations of the task force, have had to do, the SSRC is a 96-year-old organization. For most of that time, we've been doing peer review. We administer fellowship programs for the Carnegie Corporation, for the Mellon Corporation, and other large foundations. But we had to figure out how to do NSF-style peer review in a month, right? So part of that's through incentives, but part of it was through really sort of saying we could do it. I mean, we had a lot of conversations in which people were like, there's no way we could possibly ever do it, but we don't have to accept that the sort of temporality and pace of the work that we've done before, it has to be done in the same way. And it's also the case that if you pay people a couple $1,000s, they will get a nice review back to you. It'll be lush and fulsome, and they'll get it back to you by the deadline. And so, so it's an experiment also not only in sort of thinking about research collaboration, but also thinking about the various ways in which we do our work. And Jason will tell you much more. We announced our first grantees just a couple of weeks ago from 11 different countries, 30 different institutions. This is team research, so it's also a paradigm that's helping to build out sort of big data science, big social science, big information science, with scholars ranging from folks in anthropology and information science to communications and political science. So I will stop there, and I'm glad to have conversation, particularly because as we've been circulating this report over the last few months, we haven't had conversation with our library colleagues, and so I would welcome your feedback and input, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you. Is that allowed?
I have a question. Just you've cited the behaviors of private corporations in sharing data or the lack thereof. Has the push for regulation of Facebook affected the Facebook stance on the sharing of their data?
Gosh, I can't speak for them, and wouldn't try to. And also it's a big company, and I think the answer to that question would vary depending on who you asked, what part of the elephant you touched, to use that metaphor from the past. So, I think that I will say that since we started engaging in this project about a year ago, we've been approached variously by different companies and folks from the private sector who are trying to figure it out. I mean, I think there is in the private sector a developing sense of kind of corporate social responsibility that's around data, that sort of they understand that, in addition to sponsoring community events and these sorts of things, there's a potential kind of normative obligation there. I think companies are variously trying to figure it out. I mean, it's interesting, you have companies that still feel very new to some of us, but are very considered kind of old at the tech sector, like Microsoft, that built out a research unit. So there's, like in the tradition of Xerox PARC or Bell Labs, who sort of said it's important for us to have people engaged in various forms of research using our data and our tools. But the new generation of companies has not sort of made those same investments. So, this is a new paradigm, even in, being able to supply an answer to your question. I think it very much remains to be seen what this will look like. It might be the case that there are, smaller companies or consortiums of other companies. There are other, Danny Goroff at the Sloan Foundation for a very long time has been working to create administrative data research centers and networks. There's one at Michigan. And, the question is, is this a model for how you do that? So in some of those cases, going back several years, it's the case that, retail companies will share data, much like, academic institutions will pool salary data or these sorts of things that we can sort of share. Everyone's in the pool, and trust a kind of third party to be the sort of trusted intermediary for that data. But in this case, when the data is the product, it's a little bit different. And it also raises the issue of whether or not these kind of data infrastructures, these research administrative data networks, can be sustained if everyone comes to think of their data as a product or as something that can be marginally have profit made on it, as opposed to, sort of stuff you generate in the course of sort of selling hotel rooms or dresses or something like that. So I think it's an open question, Bernie, but it is the case that because Facebook has I think it's still an empirical question about what role Facebook has played in some sort of political spaces. There's lots of, we've got lots of anecdotal and kind of coincidental evidence that I think we need scholars to take a look at with regards to interventions and elections and sort of sowing polarization, disinformation, and misinformation. But it has created, obviously, a kind of public awareness and I think some pressure on the private sector to make data available for us to understand the world that we live in better.
I'm James Nye from University of Chicago. With my interest in international data, it was very pleasing to hear that the social data initiative you were describing includes the Global South. That led me to wonder if the task force had received as part of a charge any special focus or recommendation on international engagement, and if there were distinct recommendations aside from the ones you've described so far related to the Global South and other parts of the world.
That's a great question, James. Thank you. The task force very early on decided that it was only going to focus on the United States because it was just too complicated for which they were trying to accomplish. There were too many, I think, different variables and contexts, and part of what they were trying to, I think, diagnose and weigh in on was the shifting this shifting research compact and ecology after, post-war investments in research in the United States in particular. So there are, there are a few gestures and footnotes in the report, which you can find here online, but it's mostly U.S. based. We did think a bit about, I can talk about the work of the SSRC. We're just launching a project, a $2.3 million project that was founded by the Mellon Foundation that it really draws on some of the recommendations, but attacks the Global South and international piece more directly. And it's called the Transnational Collaboratory on the Indian Ocean. It's a 3-year project, and the first year of the project is actually to bring scholars from the Global North and Global South together to agree on kinds of terms of engagement. So what are our ethical kind of terms of collaborative engagement that are not researchers in the Global South in a way that's become quite pernicious with regards to randomized control trials and sort of these entities happening in other places in the world, in which our colleagues who are researchers in the Global South are effectively used as research assistants on large research teams with Global North PIs and these sorts of things. So to do a project on the Indian Ocean, which not only is it going to be about China's string of pearls and that sort of investment, but also about a very long conversation that's been going on about engagements between Africa, Asia, South Asia in this space, really is going to require, I think, a lot of trust building at a moment in which the flat federal funding for research is also impacting and has, certainly decades prior, area studies, right? So there's like little investment in area studies with the federal government. Certainly for our organization, which along with ACLS for several decades really pushed forward these joint committees on Latin America, on Slavic countries and the like. I mean, those investments stopped in the 80s, although we still have an international dissertation research program that's that, along with the Fulbright, is about the only dissertation research support one can get to work abroad. And so we felt an obligation to think about collaboration and the kind of, and how we might build out models. And in this case, I think hopefully a kind of best practices paper about how to think about international collaboration as part of, arguably a new research compact and a new way of thinking about how we do work in this moment.
David Marshall from UC Santa Barbara. All of this is really, really important work, and it's appropriately focused on research. But I wanted to say something about education, because I think it's a potential point of contact for our libraries. There's this, of course, tremendous rush on campuses towards data science, new data science degrees and programs and schools. And this is part of the sort of push towards STEM, which is understandable, but it also represents an opportunity for the humanities and social science disciplines to actually get involved at the beginning with undergraduates, not just in thinking about data literacy, but in thinking about all those ethical problems that you were talking about in terms of how to analyze data, but also how to use data. So as our students are, preparing themselves to get jobs at Facebook and Google, et cetera, it would be really important for them to start thinking about these kinds of issues. And I know that our library is getting very involved with the data science initiative and thinking about ways that the library can collaborate with the kind of educational parts of all this training. But it really would be a key moment to sort of take all of these crucial research questions and start asking them from sort of freshman through graduate student levels.
Yeah, I completely agree. Thank you for that, David. It's really helpful. It's also the case that, I think our public language about the issues that you raise is really anemic. So this idea that we need to, we need to add ethics to computer science and these sorts of things, like, really does, really sort of ignores, whole fields, legacies of conversation in the humanities and social science precisely about these issues, which is not about creating an ethics module in a computer science class, but about thinking in deep and rich ways about the implications of the research that we do, and about that being part of, as you say, the pedagogy and the educational enterprise as well as research. So thank you for that.
Gwen Bird from Simon Fraser University. I just wanted to mention another touch point with libraries, since you mentioned that this is the first time you've really had the chance to air the report with a group of librarians. You talked a bit about the challenges regarding times to publication, and I see two of the recommendations under research quality talk, I think, very directly to something that libraries can engage with. That is the recommendation to convene academic publishers and scholarly societies to rethink peer review with a special focus on issues related to publication timelines and criteria. And the other one, encourage the adoption of more pre-publication outlets to facilitate learning and sharing of ideas. These are like right in the library wheelhouse. And so I just wonder if you could comment on that and on ways that librarians and research libraries can engage with the work.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Gwen. So I think, I think it's a time for all of us to kind of, as I've been suggesting, to kind of try to think with fresh eyes about what we do. So it's clear to me that I think, what you say about the pre-publication piece being, right in the library wheelhouse. But I guess the question that I would sort of ask of all of us, actually, is sort of how do you make that a success? So how do we do it in such a way that scales up, that it's not just each institution? It reminds me, I worry that we could be, in the pre-publication space, creating kind of that moment when, in the early aughts where sort of every course had a blog, and what does all of those little blogs together sort of mean in the world? And so I guess part of what the spirit of the report would say in response to your really important and probing question would be, how do we think about this being in the library wheelhouse, and maybe thinking about an organization like CRL or some other organization that is in a meso level that can do it all together, so it's not just a bunch of institutions or regional or, or consortia of institutions kind of all doing the same thing and reinventing the wheel again and again. So I completely agree with you, but I would just ask all of us to think on the level of scale of data science, think on the level of scale of the object that we're working kind of on and with, and is there a role for this organization or other comparable organizations that are like the SSRC, or maybe the SSRC, that are supposed to support this to help us help ourselves build that kind of resource. Okay.
Thanks. My name's John Slocum. I'm a consultant with CRL, but I worked for many years at the MacArthur Foundation.
Oh,
and
yeah.
so the funder question is always sort of front and center for me. And I note that you seem to have had great success in getting a long list of funders for the Social Data Initiative. Is that because it has data in the title? And what I worry deeply about the fall off in investment for the more basic research in the social science and humanities, and what becomes of that knowledge as we get a born digital generation who has little direct exposure to it.
Yeah, I agree completely. So the Social Data Initiative naming comes after the funders' investment. So they weren't funding a social data initiative. But it is the case that they were here because they're trying to solve a problem. They're not here to invest in basic research. It just happens that they think that basic research can help them solve a problem, which they think is, and I think rightly so, a kind of crisis around understanding what's happening in the social media landscape and what its impacts are for society more generally and for politics and elections in particular. I would say one upside, I think would be that one of the funders here is Knight, and we've been doing projects with Knight for a while. And in the course of this engagement, Knight has, it's still an organization that's very much about journalism and about sort of creating certain kinds of communities and infrastructures around Miami where they're based, and also around the community of journalism. But they've just done, are just about to announce a kind of $30 to $50 million investment in research centers. So I think, my take would be that this engagement and other scholars' engagements with Knight, as Knight and other organizations beginning in 2016 were trying to figure out what was happening in the political sphere, I think gave an organization that had never really invested in basic research an appreciation for what it could accomplish. And so, we shouldn't, as much as we, lament, I think, a lack of appreciation for basic research, I think that's a sort of a story that's one that's worth telling, and that suggests that we still have some levers to really compel colleagues in this ecology about how important basic research is.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Nelson.
Thank you.